Hello, hello. Good to see folks. Can you hear me? Kind of? Hmm. Can folks hear me? Let's see. Yes? Okay. All right. I'm gonna do this. My tat. And I'm gonna wonder if there is a way. So I am zooming in from Quito, Ecuador, where I'm traveling for a while. And I think my internet connection is not quite as strong as I imagined. So it may be a little bit choppy here and there. If there's a real problem, you can let me know in the chat and we'll see what we can do. Michelle is not feeling well, so she is present but not visible on her screen there. Just come down with a cold. Mm. And yeah, it feels like it's been a while since I've been able to come to the Sunday sit. I know I had a ham radio training weekend few weeks ago, and then last Sunday I was traveling down here. And anyway, it's good to be back and to see folks. Um, yeah, looking forward to sitting together for a little while. So yeah, let's get started. Letting your eyes come to close. Noticing whatever is most clearly drawing the attention right now in the realms of your sense experiences. Sometimes everything feels so full, so solid, so wild, that it can be helpful to just kind of break down these elements of what makes up this sense of our life, the sense of presence, in terms of the six sense doors: hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, seeing, and the mind heart activity. Just this recognition that anything we experience is going to come from one of these streams. And that while six streams certainly can feel like a lot at times, there is something in that boundary of knowing that there's nothing outside of those that we need to keep track of. that we have a direct relationship with. And remembering that Vipassana is that pure process of coming to terms with whatever we have a direct relationship with. Not needing anything more for fulfillment, satisfaction. Nothing more than the relief we might feel simply being with what's real right now in the body, sound, sight, smell, taste. No deeper responsibility to construct or create, conjure. Simply receive and recognize what has arisen in the present moment. Notice whatever we notice about it, which sense stream it's a part of, textures, its tones. And ultimately, its quality of impermanence, changeability. Corelessness. We recognize the value of settling these sense experiences primarily, not rejecting or negating the truth of the others. And seeing the mind has some ability to kind of narrow the field of attention at times, simplify the project of observation, relationship. So we may settle primarily into the sensations of the body, throughout the body, seeing where they're clear, recognizable, where they may be less familiar, less easy to put a label on. You feel this huge range of sensations throughout the physical body. And just with this, we see that the attention requires a range of skills. Being able to stay with the body, not always be distracted by every sound, every thought. Or when we do, we recognize it. We recognize the qualities of thought, of emotion, distinct from physicality. We can invite the attention back to this receptive awareness, tingling, pressure, warmth, coolness, hardness, softness, moisture, dryness, all kinds of other sensations that might not so easily fall into one of these categories. Sensations that are unique, ones that are persistent, throbbing, pulsing. Even if we're not totally lost in our thoughts, mind is still playing an important part. We can experience the sensations of the body. We also can see the knowing of those sensations in the mind. And recognize the difference. Seeing that the attention, while dedicated and strong, courageous, to stay with this constantly changing stream, the unpredictability of what will happen next. You see there's an aspect of firmness that's needed with the mind. Wholeheartedness, full commitment, genuine interest in the body. But we also see there's a lightness and agility and dexterity. Things are moving so quickly. And mindfulness cannot be leaden, heavy, forceful, forcing. Any agenda we have, any striving, any grasping for a certain experience will undermine the purity of our attention. We just try to watch. We see when these factors of mind are present, commitment, the dexterity, tenderness, care, interest, open-heartedness. And of course, we see when they're not, when there's tightness or dullness, wanting, not wanting. We start to appreciate that we observe the mind just as we observe the body, without agenda, needing it to be one way or another, as it is. Energized, sleep, loving, angry, interest. Doesn't matter what's happening. The value is in seeing it clearly, recognizing it, trying to understand its need, caring for it, and letting it go as the next moment of mind or the next moment of body arises. We can have a body as our primary anchor, while still recognizing that much of our practice is watching this back and forth, this wovenness between the activity of the heart, mind, and the changing phenomena of our physical life. Not worrying about which is being observed, but knowing and keeping up as best we can, moment by moment. going to switch back to my gallery view so I can try to see everyone, but it seemed like my sound wasn't maybe coming through for a moment there. So if there's a problem when I do it, just let me know and I'll go back to this view. There you all are. Yay. Hmm. Hmm. So I've had a few just little anecdotes in the past month that I've sort of pointed in a similar direction. I thought I'd just share a little bit with folks today. When I was, my flight recently was from Kona to Los Angeles to Houston to Quito. And I usually try to stay away from the window seats for long flights, but I was on one at some point, and it happened to be a more kind of like particularly turbulent flight. And there was just this like kind of this amazing time where the turbulence was like so bad for, not super long. It was okay, but it really got pretty shaky for a little while. And it's, very unpleasant. Or I experienced that as like very unpleasant. And it's always interesting. It's like, are the physical sensations really unpleasant, or is it the perception, of what's happening is unpleasant? But it happened to be happening at a time where I was looking out the window, and it was just this like incredibly beautiful sunset, over the clouds, and you just can see these like vast expanses of clouds, and you just think about how like incredible it is, and how magical, and how human beings in any other era, before the era that we're living in, just like it just would have been like mind-boggling, and the sense of how does the mind weight the pleasant or unpleasant experiences happening at any sense door, you know? And to see that there are very like kind of clear, sometimes clear patterns in the weight that we give the pleasant experience or the unpleasant experience in one sense door and compared to another, um, under certain conditions and certain contexts, and how this practice is not one of like trying to manipulate that or like enforce a pleasant experience from one sense door onto how we're experiencing reality over another, but that we can use this truth as a tool, right? That there are times where if something is so unpleasant in one sense door, that there can be this value of going to another sense door if there is one that we find something pleasant in, right? And it's a little easier to see in these more sort of examples sometimes, but it's also true in the kind of moment to moment of our meditation practice. And both are important in terms of how we live our lives. But just this sense of like, where is there the kind of mental fortitude and strength at times to kind of anchor in the pleasant experience, that I was having in the visual realm, enough to be able to not be so consumed by the perception, the unpleasant perception of experience in the other realm that was so tied into what was happening in the physical realm, right? In the heart realm, and happening in the physical realm. And it reminded me of a few weeks beforehand. So Michelle and I were teaching in New Mexico, and then at the end of that retreat, my mom came out to visit from Massachusetts in New Mexico, and so she and I spent a week kind of just visiting, traveling a little bit in the Southwest, um, and so ins- part of the motivation for that, or the impulse that kind of got us to plan that, because we haven't done that before. It's a busy trip for us. It's full, to teach out there and then come back. Um, but that she has a metastatic breast cancer, and so we're just on like a little bit of a let's just do things, while she's still in good health to do it. Take advantage of that, kind of the time that we are sure we have right now. And so she came out, and we were in Santa Fe for just a quick trip before we went out to see some of her good friends in Bluff, Utah. And so beautiful. It's like the Southwest is like, uh, you know, sometimes I can forget how just enormous the continent is, and just like the United States is just like, it's so big, and it's so vast, and it's so varied. And so these friends we went to visit, they're really into river rafting. And I don't know anything about that. I went to college in Minnesota, and so like when I think of like what river rafting is, like I think of like college kids like with the like floating down a river on like inner tubes with like a keg, and like another inner tube or something. That was my context. Except for they were like, "Oh, you're a paddler," because I paddle, like canoe paddling in Hawaii. Like that's great because, you know, we don't want to make your mom do a lot of it, and it's kind of hard, and so uh, you'll be able to help. And one of them is almost 80, the other one's in their mid 70s, and so I was like, okay, great, let's, I'm happy to help. And it's like it's turned out to be like a 10-hour raft through the desert, like through the San Juan River, through the desert in like August. Um, and just to sort of, so first of all, I was totally useless with the rowing thing. This was like two giant oars, and my training was entirely useless. I was worse than useless. We were like spinning around and gonna like crash into the white water, and it's like, okay, I'll just sit back, and let you all do the work. And unbelievably hot and unbelievably dry, and this like this river, it's all like silty, it's like chocolate milk, and it was like all kind of like getting like rashy on my legs, and um, just like the sun just beating down, and it's like you know I I I didn't know it was going to be 10-hour day, right? Like I thought this was going to be like a few hours on the river, uh, and so it was just, and it was unbelievably beautiful. It was like, I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but it's just, I'm like, this is the like of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Just like all this incredibly shaped, like these canyons that we would go through, and rocks of multicolored, and all these like beautiful formations, um, and the kind of time where like you're going, you'd see a deer or something, and you would be the weird thing. You know what I mean? They'd kind of like look at you as you kind of went down. It's like we were the like oddities. We were like the exotic things there, and golden eagles, and like a bunch of like incredible ancient Puebloan structures still visible, like on the canyon walls. I mean, like magical, incredibly beautiful, powerful, and like miserable, right? Like so miserable. And also this like, do they not know? Like they do know that my mom is in her like 20th week of chemotherapy, right? And like what are we what are we doing? And like of course, like what happens out here if something goes wrong, and they're very confident, and I'm not always so confident like in those contexts. But it was just this, but even in the moment I was like, this is so confusing, because it's like the physical unpleasantness was so strong, and the discomfort, and then the like emotional psychological piece of like, I'm totally not helpful. My mom is not well, uh and like how much longer, like, and then when at some point we were aware of how long this was going to take. It didn't take, it was clear that I was like, this is like, oh my god, only 6 more hours of this. And then to go from that into just like such appreciation, and how, again, utterly unique an opportunity this was. And of course, to feel this sort of like, that they're so joyful, right? Of like being able to share this with us, and bring us on this thing that they love so much. Uh, it was so amazing to kind of like to kind of negotiate that for a little while, and then it was just like hour after hour, right? Like going through like the sort of same material, but it was like truly really profound, and on various levels of like, there was some part of it of like, okay, where do I manage the mind in this, right? Where do I see that like there's enough tendency of like slipping into a really kind of negative perspective, um, that's easy, that's sort of familiar and kind of easy for me, um, to be like, without denying that, and without also maybe denying some part of that that's like wise, right? Of like, okay, well, if something happens, like, how do we get out of here? Or what does that look like? Or, thinking about those kinds of things. But also just the sense of like, okay, like I can anchor in the visual realm, right? And the appreciation of that. And maybe some of the, mental and emotional things that it evokes that are really positive and really wonderful. Um, so there was that sense of like, where is there, practice as tool, um, but not to confuse the tool with truth, right? Like that there's a way to manage in very unpleasant situations. At times there might be ways of managing where there's like, maybe at some sense door there you still have access to something that's like, um, pleasant on some level, right? And that I was fortunate with a great deal of physical discomfort to have a great deal of visual pleasantness to be able to try to anchor it, um, and and how kind of interesting that was, and to be able to kind of, to practice with, right? And then of course just practice with the physical experiences as they are, and kind of go through that, and go through where it's like, oh yeah, where do I get triggered around, dying in the middle of the desert for no really good reason, uh, kind of thinking. uh, and so then there's another part which I think is almost, it's less, I don't say it's more or less profound or more or less technical, but this other side of like, there's a part of my mind that wanted to just know, was I having a bad time or was I having a good time, right? Like, was this a good experience or was this a bad experience? And it's just hilarious, right, to see the mind like just wanting some solidity around that, wanting to just be like, this is awful, or like, this is amazing, and wanting to be able to land on one of those things being true, and how impossible that was, right? And how unnecessary it is, actually. This sense of like starting, seeing the way in which that is, of course, part of this process of the mind trying to create a kind of coherent story of me, right? Of self, of like, well, today was a good day, today was a bad day. That kind of narrative, of kind of locking this range of sort of sense experience that can happen in a moment or throughout a day or weeks, months, years, and kind of just like, this is this, and being able to have that be a solid thing that is kind of, put in a box and tied up and certain about, and how much we do that, how much a tendency is, we may say it's like, well, this is hard. Maybe we try to balance maybe our perspective, but still there's a sense of like, we've come to terms with this, defining this experience as good or bad, right? And how understandable that is, right? That the heart wants to do that, but also how impossible it is in certain circumstances, and what a relief it can be to not need to do that, right? Of like really seeing that every moment is different, and at every sense door, every moment is different. And this truth of the uncontrollability and unpredictability, the wildness of experience at every sense door, that doesn't allow us, if we're really paying attention, to just define, solidify, concretize our day or our sitting or our meal or our whatever as like good or bad, if we're really paying attention. And actually how important that is to be honest about, right? So that to get that that's not just a practice of like, well, if things are bad, try to focus on the positive, because, and whether that means like mentally or in terms of another sense door where there's pleasant experience, it's like to get that there's a value to that tool, but it's not to say that that is necessarily like the deepest truth that Vipassana can offer, which is to say like, well, you always have access to the positive amidst the negative. It's more like you see the way that the mind, the attention, the kind of patterns of self and of heart and mind, not just meanness, right? But it's trying to just concretize view and concretize perspective, and solidify our perspective on things, right? And how ultimately that untrue it is always, not to say that like you can't say, well, there was more good than bad, or there was, or that there isn't a value, and that there's not going to be some part of that, of course, that continues, but that it is important to see the trap in that, right? The pattern in that is understandable, but also it's not in alignment with the truth. I think we've shared before sometimes the Penang Sayadaw, who's helped us at the Chaswell retreat now for some years, would talk about Sayadaw U Pandita, who would say to his monks and nuns, when anyone asks you how you're doing, never say good. You could say okay, right? Because if you're really honest and you're really watching, if you have a body, there's no way you can just say I'm good, right? That there's always something, right? If you really pay attention, there's unpleasant sensations at the very least, right? If not, it's like really consuming, and so you have this sort of like, you have what maybe feels a little more like familiar spiritual advice of like, well, look at the positive, right? Like, look at the pleasant. Like, don't always get so consumed by how bad things are. And then you have like Sayadaw Pandita's advice. Like, no, look at the unpleasant. Like don't be so confident that things are are so great. And it's and we're often like, of course there's like a pull in the heart in that, but that there's something very important about that in terms of the practice, right? Of like just being honest and being real about what's happening, like being in alignment with the truth, and not needing to be so consumed by the polarities of pleasant, unpleasant, right? Of being like, and that this is the way things are, or that this is the way things are, but that there is like in this, manifold experience of heart, mind, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, the body, that we're going to have pleasant, unpleasant, neutral experiences, and that there is this way in which like we manage it as some reflections on this as helpful tools of like to not get over exuberant, right? To not kind of get attached to pleasant experience and so identified with pleasant experience of like, I'm having a great time. And it's like, it's not to take away the joy of that it's like, I don't need to go into a whole talk also about the Brahma Viharas and like appreciative joy and appreciation are important parts of the practice. These are valid and valuable mind states, right? So it's like, it always feels like sometimes we have to like put everything in context, but it's to say that it's like we can get so consumed by the pleasant that we lose contact with the unpleasant and with the true nature of things, which is not to say the true nature of things is unpleasant, it's that the true nature of things is unpredictable, right? And that because of the unpredictability, there's suffering. And that to deny that in order to maintain a sense of upliftment, right, is delusion, right? That if we're in denial of the very easily accessible, unpleasant experiences that might be arising, even in times of great joy, is to not be connected to the truth. And it's not to deny the joy, but it is to try to be careful, right, with kind of like how we are practicing in our lives, how we're trying to manage through technique and tools, but also not think that the ways that we're using the tools are also like the truth in and of themselves, but it's a way to sort of try to keep us in balance with the truth. Similarly, some of you were at Vaisitos this year, and I'm not sure if Michelle, spoke on this already, but it was very powerful to be there, as usual and as always. But there was something this year around like how dry it is, and these fires, and we did, we talked about, that a few weeks ago. But a kind of similar sort of process and a similar sort of tendency and patterns, that I think all of us who were there went through at times of like, because it was so dry, and especially folks who had been there before, sometimes it felt very stark just how crunchy the forest was, the ground, and how little water there was, how few wildflowers there were compared to other years. Fires that arose in the distance that we were aware of, that sometimes we could smell. And so the reality of these fires and the kind of global situation, was very present. And so, or maybe in years past, people would go to a retreat center like that, that's so kind of in the wilderness and remote, to some degree, it does feel like a refuge from our lives and from the, some of the more familiar patterns of hardship and daily dukkha. And you get to be in this beautiful place, and it's a relief, and there's something so powerful about going to this place and being kind of really much more face to face for many of us with the reality of climate change and drought and the fires and all of that, then we might be at home. And so this sense of it as like not the same kind of escape, not that they're meant to be escapes, but there is this idea that you go somewhere where perhaps things are kind of less evocative on certain levels, to be able to just be able to practice internally. And so, very similar kind of processes unfolded for many of us there, of like so appreciative of having the time, so still, moved by the beauty and wildlife and things like that, of, being in Sangha and, sitting together. And then also the very kind of direct, the physicality of the tangibility of drought, and of the kind of what that would, the way that we of course interpret that, to some degree internally in the mind, about what it means for our planet, what it means for our lives, and all of the how evocative that is for so many of us. And I think again, it's like there was often this tendency of like in the heart to want it to be one way or the other, right? Of like this is a negative experience, right? Or like trying to be like this is a positive experience, even though there's this negative stuff there, and how hard it is to not need to like put it in a box, to not need to be like, well, this is this, but rather to be sensitive enough in each moment to the realities that we're experiencing in the heart and the mind and the body, directly and, through more mental processes. It's like showing up for all of it. And I think that piece of it also feels so important as like, this question of like, if it gets drier and drier and in 5 years or 10 years, say it's a desert out there, it's like, would we stop going? Would people stop visiting this place? Even though they love it, even though they've been going for years, even though it's like, would we feel a sense of, well, it's not pleasant enough, And what does that mean about like our relationship with any place, that we're not willing to go through the realities and the changing realities of them, and that we're not able to see beyond just, oh, this is now this and this is this and this is this, the sort of like, the boxes we put everything in. And how is that also true for ourselves, our bodies, our minds? Would we stop being in relationship, with our bodies as we get older, or as we're sick, as unpleasant experiences arise, sometimes in more persistent ways, or do we develop an ethic of commitment, of relationship, to ourselves, to one another, to land, to place, to communities, to society, that isn't just based on our interpretation of if they're kind of satisfying our perspective, or if there's enough pleasant versus unpleasant in the kind of weighting, of them. And that those are actually very profound patterns in us, that show up in all kinds of ways in our lives. And that it's important to recognize that these things can be explored just on this basic level of like, when we're having a really hard time, what is it like to tune in to another sense door? I remember talking to someone at some point last year. It was like just when they got really sick and their stomach was like, the body was so unpleasant, right, in terms of the illness that they had, and the only thing that felt like sort of that they could be, that the attention kept going to the sound of like traffic far away, outside in the distance. And there was this sense that they were like, is that, I should be able to be in my body. This should be, this is the practice, is like be with all this unpleasant sensation. But to see that the mind was naturally kind of like going to some distant place that was, where you just hear this sort of swishing of cars in the distance, and that was soothing. That was like the mind itself was choosing to do that, and that there's something really amazing in that, and not to fight that, and that might be more available than we think. Or if we are having a joyful time and we are very feeling more exuberant, it's like, where do we also just like not lose our grounding? Where do we start to see that we might start making decisions based on a kind of drunkenness, maybe not alcohol related drunkenness, but a pleasant experience related drunkenness, and where is the sort of appreciation for the soberness, the sobriety, the groundedness of like not denying that, but also not getting so caught up in it that we lose our perspective. And I guess, yeah, just where is the where where do we see the desire to have a less complicated experience and a less nuanced relationship to experience as a way of creating ourselves and solidifying the world and our lives, of like of putting things in a sort of like evaluative program, and where do we allow things to not always be so easily resolved in the heart, and where might that give us access to something very important when it comes to the teachings around non-self, the unbinding of those tendencies. Yeah. Yeah, so we have a little time, if anyone has any questions. I think, Michelle thankfully is resting with her flu symptoms. But I'm happy to take any questions if any folks have them. Just a reminder that the bottom of the page, the little reactions button there, if you click on that, the raise your hand is the easiest way for me to see that you have a question. Or you can just type that you have a question in the chat, and I'll mark it. Hi, Samantha. I think you can unmute. Yeah.
Hi, Jeffrey. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Along the lines of what you were talking about, how is it cultivating the neutral comes into place?
Oh, I'm unmuted. Um, I mean, I would say primarily in two ways, that sort of occur to me right now around that also is like that maybe we don't have to, like, I think the example of the person who was so sick and kind of went to the sound of the cars in the distance, that it may have qualified as like a pleasant experience, or it may have qualified more as a neutral experience, right? Kind of depending on whatever conditions and personality and all those things. But certainly neutral is another place to go, right? So I definitely focused on the sort of bigger polarity, that sometimes can be helpful. But absolutely, I think, last I'm visiting family, many of whom I haven't seen in like 20 years, right? And so I went to a wedding yesterday, and it was like very fun and wonderful and exuberant. And that's not that's not always like my first, like, the gear I most naturally like fall into, but it's like, okay, right, that's like yes, we're happy, samsara, Yay, right. And uh like let's rejoice in all of the wonderful, like the love, and of course there's like great things. But definitely throughout the night it was like, oh, I'd find myself, it's like, where do I see the neutral? And where I would find the neutral is like everyone working there, right? Where it's like they do this every night, right? It's like you look around and people are just washing the dishes and at this, like, place where weddings happen, right? And it's like
Mhm.
there's just that, like, okay, just right around here is just like everyone's just working and it's just like another wedding. It's not negative, it's just like their job. And that was a total anchor for me kind of through the night, where it's like, where I would be like, oh, this is wonderful, and I'd be like not so into it, right? Where it's like, oh, right, this is just reality, it's just life, it's being, right? And so that was certainly something. It's something that I go to and I think is also a helpful tool. So, on that level of like the tool technique side of things, 100%. Um, there is also the sense that I think ultimately it's exactly what it leads to, is the neutral of equanimity, not the neutral of sort of like dullness or
Mhm.
numbness, right? But there is this sense of like, oh yeah, ultimately the mind is kind of calibrated, and attuned to life so that it appreciates joy, but it's not getting, overwhelmed by it. It feels the reality of hardship and sorrow, mentally, emotionally, physically, but it's not necessarily getting drowning in it. And so really there is this sense, but by finding the kind of, and it's why I think using the more polarity version of like the kind of dichotomy of pleasant versus unpleasant as the kind of framework. It's that ultimately that we are, it's not that things stop being pleasant or unpleasant, right? So it's not like life becomes more neutral. It's that the mind is more balanced in relationship to this wide range and this wildness of things. And that just feels like a very important thing to distinguish between. It's not that like we stop feeling pleasant, we stop feeling joy, and we stop feeling pain, and we stop feeling, it's like this isn't a process of kind of getting duller and duller, like just like everything is gray. But it is a sense of, and I think of course that's what many of us, at different times in our practice, may fear, right? The sense that like through the kind of disenchantment that we're going to lose things that we value about ourselves, right? And lose an appreciation of who we are and of life and culture, and um, that's just not what's happening, right? But it's also that we do become disentangled from it, right? That there is more access to peace and stability and quietude and balance, amidst all of it, and that's really important. So yeah, thanks, Samantha. Great question.
Thank you.
Mm.
Very pleasant, not
Ah.
neutral.
See, Jean.
Hi there. Thank you. It's really wonderful. So I was reflecting a little bit on um, also being afraid of the pleasant at times, right? Like, um, so for example, I have a family member who's had just had a really difficult path, and is now having like kind of broke through something, is having a wonderful time doing something very courageous, um, and I'm like, the mudita is just kind of bubbling over, just so delighted for the delight that he's experiencing, um, and also noticing the fear of the crash almost, right? Like him kind of coming back to, his usual life, and, maybe kind of having a big right? It's bumpy sometimes when you do that. And then my own fear for like, it's like, it's quite exuberant. So I will, kind of look for all of the flavors of, Vedana, perhaps as a way to balance out, but just in this process, I realized I've had this again and again, even in my own life, when I've gone through really tough times and then things turn good and I'm like, wait for the other shoe to drop, baby, it's coming, and so that whole process is also just kind of interesting from a practice perspective. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's like, I don't want to overstate like that it's like really simple or easy to do, because it's like such a good example of how the way this kind of thing plays out, in very real ways, and then relationally. I don't know that you're totally saying this, but I'll sort of add this to what you're, especially if someone is having a really hard time, or that there's like a sense that they've just been like, or that maybe they have a tendency towards, more depressive states, and we are invested in their happiness, and we want them to be happier, whatever that means, and that their pain is hard for us, right? And so the other aspect of that, of like, when there is joy for them, when someone has like a really positive time, and especially if it seems to last, or even if not, it's like this sense of that sometimes it can be like a clinging to that, just like wanting this to last and wanting this to stabilize for them. And we also take into account what we know about someone's personality, or tendencies, or what have you. Obviously this is all could be true for ourselves as much as, but this idea of like, it's someone we care about in our lives is an important kind of little aspect to this that I think it's worth addressing on its own, and it's I do feel like it is a place where the Brahma Viharas become in so importantly, and are so designed for this kind of thing, because they're just, it's so, while we are trying to kind of like not totally fall into a fixed view of what's possible in our own lives and the lives of someone else, and what's happening the next moment in the world, that we also, it's not like there isn't a place for cognitive process of understanding that, well, this person does have patterns, and or this world has patterns, and in the past we've learned to some degree that actually when we get over exuberant, that there often is a crash, and that is part of the pattern, right? It's like, the teaching is not to say, it's just like to just deny our past experiences and what we might have learned over time, around our own patterns or someone else's. And I think that question of like, where is it, like, a mature human being reflects on past things to imagine something about the present, and or to kind of fathom the present and imagine the future. That's not like a pathology in and of itself. But of course, you're also experiencing this place of like, these patterns can also develop in our sense of faith in someone, a sense of kind of negative inevitability, and it is important to recognize the times that we're proven wrong in those things, because that does happen, and that part of it feels like we have to be careful of just such what you see, even you said of like, you get that your heart is trying to protect itself through this bracing for an quote unquote inevitable negative outcome, and you just have to treat that as like something, of course, the heart is going to do. It's not ridiculous, but it's also not it's also a fantasy. Like there's another part of it which it's like, okay, right now this is what's happening, and that is all we actually know for sure. And that, yes, we could wager on what's going to happen in 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, and we may or may not be right. And but that is kind of, there's a part of that that's irrelevant in terms of like showing up for what's happening right now. And in the most mature way, mudita isn't attached to to joy continuing, right? It's like we appreciate the joy, and it's, if it's the deepest mudita is totally balanced by wisdom. And so there's no, it's, the appreciation is not a threat at all to our own mental stability. That it's not surprise at all when unpleasant experiences arise or pleasant experiences dissipate, and it's like the mind is then ready to be compassionate, and it's like that is a very, that person's experience could go downhill or not, but if it does, the only difference is like, have you ridden the wave of mudita as like its most, as best we can, as its most mature form of appreciation that's totally doesn't believe that it's going to last, but that's the fullest expression of appreciation, right? That's not like a diminished appreciation. It's actually like the fullest mudita is one that doesn't expect it to last, right? And the fullest compassion is one that doesn't need things to change, right? It's like that these are they're totally not attached to whatever happens next. They're just, the mind is ready for whatever happens next. And so there's that version of it, and then there's the like, oh well, I knew this was going to happen, and I'm right, this person is just who they are, and and things are just solid, kind of like I was saying, right? It's like, this is who we are, and this is the dynamic, and it's not to say there isn't some truth in that, right? But it's, to think that that's the truth is like a prison, for ourselves and for the people we love. Yeah. Yeah, it's great. May the other shoe never drop. Patricia.
Yeah. Hi, Jesse. I've never met you. I used to sit with Michelle 30 years ago at Spirit Rock and Santa Sabina Center, and I just been sort of coming in and out of this sitting, which I'm really loving. And I guess I live on Maui, and I'm struggling with like when you talked about sitting on that airplane and feeling that uncomfortableness. I know exactly what you mean, but I guess what's happening here is so many things at once that it's really hard to somehow be with it all. So I find myself kind of, I guess it's like pretending nothing's happening, but then when I'm a therapist myself, and when and then it's just like everything's happening and it's unfathomable. And when I think about it, I've asked many of my teachers at different times, how to deal with things like that are happening in India or happening in other places that when you think about them, you feel so horrible. And they would always say, well, do what you can when it's in front of you. That was the answer that I would get. But I'm finding myself kind of a little bit hiding because I'm so sensitive to what, and I noticed some of the things would trigger into my own, like parents maybe coming home and losing their children, and I think about when I was little, I had an experience sort of like that. So it's triggering it into all of that. And I'm just kind of wanting to be present with it, but also, I don't know, almost too many things going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's that part of like a disaster where there's the disaster itself and the first days, and then there's this like, this is like the the reality of like how much, the profundity of it, and the profundity of the brokenness, and how long and how much effort and how complicated it is to try to attend to, you know, the population's needs, and all the variety of them, and all of the politics around it, and all the different perspectives around it. I mean, it's like the, of course, it's like what's happened in Lahaina is such a horrible and microcosmic version, right, of, you just see it, right? It's like with Katrina, with Marrakesh, right, with like every other version of like, it's this happening of like the, it's not just the initial shock, and it's not just the sort of first kind of wave of it. It's like this ends up being a lot of what ends up being really traumatic, right? It's not just the fire, it's not just the earthquake. It's like the complexity and the grind and all of the pieces that everyone involved has to go through and keep managing day to day, in terms of trying to get all of these practical things done, and at the same time, you know, stay human and stay connected. And so it's just to say, I mean, I really appreciate what you're saying about just how overwhelming it can be, and watching the desire to sort of like tune out and to get some space, and to not pathologize that, I guess, would be, you know, the sort of the starting place of like just really seeing that we have to trust that the mind, heart has its limits of what it has achieved equanimity with, right? Where it feels like it can still find connection to love and care, and in its truest expressions, right? Amidst so much turbulence and turmoil and tumult, and that there's new tumults and new, you know, it's like the all of the complexity that keeps building in terms of the human dynamics playing out, and of course the natural, you know, human and non-human dynamics playing out. And so I just, you know, I think that we should really do need to see that's like everyone is going to be doing that to some degree or another, consciously or not, whether that means like alcohol, or whether that means like watching a movie, or whether it means just like taking a nap, or you know, there's a lot of ways that the mind and society can provide to dull the edge of the, you know, kind of knife blade of reality. And I think that what we have to appreciate is like there's something there that's like really important to honor and to recognize, and that of course we recognize there's versions of that that can be really dangerous, right, and really unhealthy, and lead to more catastrophe and more tumult, right, and less of ability for people to kind of like get together and fix things and work together, and, you know, have some kind of like response that holds our humanity at the center. And so, and yet part of our humanity is realizing when we're at the edge, and when we can't be in it, and to not force it, because when we do force it, and not that there aren't times where it's like we need to move beyond a little bit where we think we are, especially in emergencies. It's like, okay, we need to stretch, right? We are called to move beyond what feels comfortable, what feels maybe beyond our degree of training at times, and there is a sense of like, if you're spending too much time beyond that, you're gonna end up doing damage, right, to yourself and ultimately to others. That it's gonna be coming from a place that's not really just love, right? It's not really just compassion. It's not really necessarily balanced, and that you start to ingrain other patterns that are less healthy, right? That are coming through striving and aversion, and, you know, and that ends up creating a little bit of, not that there aren't times where you just have to use whatever energy is available, but you have to be very careful with it, and especially when it comes to like, yeah, not just how we're engaging and how we're disengaging, both, right? So that not to feel like the engagement is better and the disengagement is worse, because you can do both of them skillfully and you can do both of them harmfully, right? And so just being cognizant of that and seeing like, where is the heart open and receptive and feels like it can be connected in a strong way, where does that get hard but still feels important, and where are the times where you just like, you can't deal, you can't like go read a whole bunch of articles on like the 2,000 people that just died in Morocco and all of the horror of that. You know, it's just like, actually your system isn't calibrated enough to manage all the voltage of that. And like, that's wisdom. That's not like we're not enough. It's just like, actually just you need to find ways of like dropping the voltage, you know, and letting your system rest to whatever degree it can. And it's like, yeah, it may not be able to rest the same degree it could have 2 months ago, but so that, you know, that you might not find that same sort of space right now of like, but you can find something, you know, that's also not doing harm, you know, and just appreciate that like we need to go through these rhythms, and that any kind of disaster like this is going to call for us to, or create situations under which we're not able to just like always protect ourselves as much as we might be accustomed to, or as much as we might long to. But that there are still ways of doing it, right? And that some of the disengaging, the zoning out, the tuning out is actually necessary and helpful and healthy. And it's actually it's like a circuit breaker, right? And you have to respect it, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know, Molly, you're also in Maui, right?
Yeah, I am now. I was in Oaxaca, Mexico when the fires hit. So it was a very surreal thing to be that emotionally connected with Maui, and at the same time be in this exuberantly, you know, out there place. I walk out the doors, just people and color, and the people I knew there would hold space with me briefly, and then Mexico would come back, and I had this survivor's guilt and traveler's guilt going through, and couldn't wait to get home, just couldn't wait to get my hands on the wheel in some way. But then you actually get here. I actually got here last Sunday, and it's such a different island than the one I left, you know, this before and after. And the island in July, my prayer for it was, oh my God, we have to do something to slow this tourist, not the humans coming are wonderful humans, but the story behind the driving to get more people, to get more money, to get more, you know, on the back of the island itself. Just, it was just so painful to watch it from COVID peace going back beyond what it had been before. And my sense now is that there's a community connection like I haven't felt in the 35 years I've lived here. It's so powerful. So your talk, Jesse, was really I almost felt like it was going right into me about the good, bad, that they're coexisting, and if I dare breathe those words in the midst of this much, you know, apocalypse, it does still, it's so resonant. The love, the aloha, the potential, that little picture that I know probably most people have seen of that little sprout of the banyan tree just coming back, and I just keep putting that back, recycling that. Like that's the only thing that can really hold my heart steady, is that, not perseverating and papanchaing on too many things. Anyway, thanks for the chance to
Yeah,
talk, because I just like,
absolutely. You know,
yeah,
it's so
I just been
powerful. Yeah.
aching for this so much, to be with you all. And yeah, thank
Well, I'm
you.
glad you're home. And
Yeah.
it's like that peculiar kind of like dissociated experience of, that's of course very modern or contemporary, where it's like you can be one place, but your home is somewhere else. And you can watch live what's happening there. And that's so much a part of all of our lived experience in some ways these days. And how like kind of how disorienting that is and can be. And I think that sense of like, it's not that there's anything wrong with trying to orient, or this sense of like I want to get home and just be there and have it be more coherent, um, and there is this sense of like we live in a very that sort of disembodied, disoriented, like that's such a part of all of our lives. And where are the times where that it's okay that they're not coherent, right? Where we're not always looking for coherence, and it's like, well, there's this thread and there's this thread, and they seem to be in conflict, but they also both seem to be true. And where can we have the sort of capacity of the heart to not always need to always resolve all of it in order to move forward? There was I used to work with an organization, Stone Circles, and we were just kind of focused on social justice activists, organizers, and stuff who are trying to integrate spiritual practice into their lives. And we had an exercise that we would do. God, I'm not gonna remember the name of the. We had a very clever word for. Mm, anyway, it was basically like this truth of like we can have more than one thing's happening in our heart at the same time that both feel really important and both feel really true, and that feel also that they're in opposition with one another. And that it's so much more important to be able to hold that complexity than to deny one of those truths for the sake of the other, or because this is sort of like what's, this is kind of what we're all doing, right? It's like, well, we have to pick one truth to kind of like move forward with. And it's a situation like Mao, I mean, you can just see it's just like, and like any of these, or, where I am now, I mean, just like the political reality of like everywhere is so complicated. Even the banyan tree, I was talking to someone who's like very involved in water stuff in Maui, and he was like, I've always hated that banyan tree. It's like they're invasive. It's like a water sucker. It's like the banyans are like terrible ecologically, right? They're like, and they're part of like a history of everything. Well, you know that thread, right? And you're like, I'm like, yes, totally. And I'm like, you have everyone is like dying for some leaf to come out of the banyan tree, right? Or it's just like that's the sign of hope, And it's like, how do you reconcile these things in our heart, in your own heart? How do you get that it's going to be very complicated to reconcile a bunch of stuff, like everything, right? Around tourism, around land ownership and value. I mean, there's so many things where you feel those forces line up of being like, there's just this battle, like on all of these fronts that's sort of like beginning. And, it's just like, where can we hold that in our hearts too? Of like being willing to hold complexity and dissonance. Where is our need for resolution, you know, understandable, but also not leading us towards wise decisions, right? Or wise way of being, or helpful in our communities. Where is it actually part of a strength of heart that develops, of being able to recognize, I mean, whether it's in different sense stores, like I was talking in my talk, or just different things, that truths, right, in our hearts. It's like, where can we hold the tension of dissonance in a way that feels mature and feels engaged and feels honest, and doesn't need, and where do we see that so much of what is happening is just a compulsion towards identification of like, well, I believe this and this must be the right way, and you can rationalize your view and your perspective, and not that I don't have mine, or that isn't going to happen on some level, but where do you also hold that tendency and that momentum with a little bit of like spaciousness of being like, well, there are also things in our hearts that we recognize, that other people might have a perspective that's different than ours. And however we're going to get through this is not just by overriding, what that person feels like is really true. And I think you're right. I mean, so much of what is like so inspiring about Maui is like the community's self-organizing things that are happening around like being willing to kind of go through these conversations and arguments, and it's not always easy, it's not always elegant, often not, but it's like, you just have to do it. Like, there's actually not a shortcut, and that actually, the guy who was talking about the banyan tree, this is part of, it's like, sometimes whether it's in the courts or whether it's in a community, it's like you have to go through it. And so much of our inability to stay in the tension and stay in the conflict and stay in the hardship has to do with our own discomfort, or wanting resolution, or wanting what we want, and not that things can always stay unresolved forever. I mean, that's like its own pathology, right, internally and culturally, socially. But on the other hand, we have to be very careful about where our own limited development spiritually is giving us a sense of certainty and enforcing a need externally that's like not wholesome, and not helpful. And to see the spiritual value of like, it's hard to hold these things, and just, of course, when you're in the thick of it, that there isn't always the refuge to like get space from it and let it kind of marinate, or let your mind kind of digest it, because it's like every day. But to be as intentional as we can be to like know where we're finding space, or we're creating like the ability for the mind to try to be at least as capable. And that's the beautiful thing about Hawaii too, right? Where it's like the spiritual frameworks are like up front all the time, where it's like aloha, pono. It's like these words that we might use more casually at times, but that are like very real and have very real implications about how people interact, that we're very fortunate in that way, and it's not all that needs to be part of what, kind of resolves thing, but it's a pretty powerful, important thing, and that we're in times where it's like, this is it, this is where we're all going to be. No, this is just how it's going to be, and it'll be more or less distant for all of us, but it's like, okay, where are we developing these tools to live in the tumult, and how important that is, how important it's going to be, and to see our own stress and our own tension, our own exhaustion as spiritually valuable for ourselves, but also for the world, is important, Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. Yeah. Take good care of yourselves and each other. We'll send Michelle our metta for her flu to ease quickly. And anyone else who might be sick or unwell in our Sangha or around. Yeah. Okay, my microphone. Take care, everyone. Aloha.